Resonance, a sci-fi romance by Cosmic Novels.
Chapter 1. The Ghost in the Static. The only sound in the audio lab was the low, circulatory hum of the air purifiers and the solitary lament pouring from the speakers. To Dr. Elara Vance, it was more than sound. It was a presence. A structured pulse, a haunting melody that traveled 600 light-years from the orbit of a red dwarf, only to die in this dark, sterile room. It was the signal from Kepler 186f, and it was her obsession, her sanctuary, and her ghost. Leaning over the console, the amber glow of the display casting long shadows across her focused face, Elara adjusted the antimatter filter with a practiced touch. The cascade of stellar noise fell away, leaving only the clean, impossible signal. There it was. The pattern repeated, not like a mechanical broadcast, cold and indifferent, but like a sigh. There was a profound mathematics to it, a sonic architecture too complex to be a natural occurrence, yet imbued with a loneliness that felt ancient, almost geological. It was a funeral dirge for a world she'd never known, sung by a voice she felt more than heard. The work was her refuge, her penance. For 18 hours a day, she lived in this hermetically sealed chamber, surrounded by gleaming chrome racks and coiled fiber optic cables, the universe reduced to a waveform on a screen. A high-pitched whine from an overtaxed capacitor in the corner made her flinch, a sound too close to memory. For an instant, the distant star's lament was replaced by the shriek of twisting metal and the brittle pop of fracturing carbon fiber. Red lights flashing, painting the cockpit in strokes of blood. The alarm, a shrill, desperate scream that cut through everything. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and the metallic tang of panic. Jorik's voice on the comms, not a shout, but a final, muffled sound of surprise. Lena's gasp. Then the silence. A silence deeper and more terrible than any interstellar void. A perfect vacuum where her friends had just been. Elara blinked hard, the memory receding like a reluctant tide. Her team. Lost in the Cygnus X1 gravitational anomaly because of a calculation she had triple-checked 100 times. A calculation that had been correct. But guilt didn't care about correctness. It was a parasite that fed on hypotheticals. So she worked, diving into the mysteries of others so she wouldn't drown in her own. She turned to her logbook, her fingers hovering over the holographic keyboard. Log entry, Cycle 734.4, Dr. Elara Vance reporting. Subject, Kepler 186f sonic anomaly. Continued analysis confirms the signal is not merely audio. Its core frequency, 1.618 Hz, the golden ratio of all things, exhibits a direct and unwavering resonance with human brainwave patterns during the REM state. The correlation is too precise to be coincidence. It's as if it's tuning itself to us. Speaking a language our brains recognize, even if our minds do not. It is structured, layered, and carries what I can only describe as emotional weight. She paused, her lips pursed into a thin line of frustration. Recommendation for a deep listening probe has again been denied. Command considers my findings instrument error and data artifacts resulting from sensor fatigue. They see numbers on a report. They refuse to hear the voice. I have exhausted my discretionary processing credits running the analysis through back channels. They are content to let this be a ghost in the static, a footnote in a survey report. A soft, unobtrusive light blinked in the corner of her console, an incoming call, priority flagged. With a resigned sigh, she accepted it. The tired, weathered face of Commander Reese appeared on the screen, the lines around his eyes deeper than she remembered. Elara said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of wariness. Elara, he said, his voice a low, no-nonsense baritone that held a hint of I have an update on your project. If it's to tell me my lab time has been cut again, Reese, you can save your breath, she replied, her tone sharper than she'd intended. On the contrary, he said, his expression unreadable as he ignored her hostility, Aegis Corp is making some budget reallocations. They want to fast-track projects with potential for tangible return. Apparently, your mystery signal has caught their eye. Elara felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. Aegis Corp was a behemoth, a corporate entity that values patents over planets and profit over people. And what does that mean exactly? That they want to slap a copyright on it and sell it as a ringtone? It means they're giving you more resources, Reese continued, his gaze unreadable as he ignored her hostility. Specifically, an exploration pilot. He's to fly you out there. You get to do your research on site. Elara's blood ran cold. The words hit her like a physical blow, a violation of the sanctity of her work. A pilot? Reese, that's out of the question. This is delicate work. My methods are precise. I need time, isolation. I can't have some hotshot flyboy hovering over my shoulder, rushing the science for a corporate deadline. It's not a choice, Elara, Reese said, and for the first time she detected a genuine note of apology in his tone. Aegis is funding this outpost. When they say jump, we ask how high. He's the best we have. A bit of a maverick, has a file as long as my arm, but he'll get you there and back in one piece. He arrives on the next transport. She felt a wave of claustrophobia, the walls of her lab suddenly closing in. A maverick? That's the last thing I need. Who is he? She asked, her voice low and tight, already feeling her sanctuary being invaded by an unknown variable she couldn't control. Reese hesitated for a moment, pulling at his collar as if it had suddenly grown too tight. His name is Kaelen.
Chapter 2. The Maverick. The transport arrived precisely on schedule, a fact Elara noted with a kind of grim satisfaction. Punctuality was a virtue she appreciated, even if it was delivering a variable she had no desire to account for. She watched from the lab's narrow observation window as the ramp lowered, disgorging a handful of weary-looking engineers, and finally, him. Kaelen's presence was a disruption before he even spoke a word. He moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was entirely out of place in the sterile, right-angled world of the outpost. He wasn't just tall, he was broad-shouldered and solid, filling his dark gray flight suit in a way that suggested contained power. A web of fine, silvery lines traced a path from his temple down his neck, disappearing beneath his collar. More cybernetics, more complex than standard-issue neural links, snaked around his left arm forearm, the metal gleaming under the harsh halogen lights of the docking bay. He was a man built for motion, for impulse, and Elara felt an instinctive wave of distrust. He was the embodiment of everything her work was not: loud, unpredictable, and dangerous. She retreated from the window and was standing over her console, feigning deep concentration, when the door to her lab hissed open. "Dr. Vance, I was told I could find you hiding in here amongst the charts and squiggles." The voice was a low, confident baritone with an undercurrent of amusement that immediately set her teeth on edge. She turned slowly. He leaned against the doorframe, a lazy, charming smile playing on his lips. Up close, she could see the faint lines of experience around his eyes, a stark contrast to the almost unnerving perfection of his cybernetic enhancements. "I'm not hiding, pilot. I'm working. And I would appreciate it if you didn't refer to my life's work as squiggles." He pushed off the doorframe and strolled into the lab, his boots making soft, rhythmic sounds on the metallic floor. He moved like a predator surveying new territory, his gaze sweeping over the racks of equipment before settling on her. "My apologies, Doctor. No offense intended. I'm Kaelen." He extended his right hand, the one that was fully human. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before taking it. His grip was firm, warm, and brief. "I know who you are. I've read your file." His smile didn't falter, but his eyes sharpened. "All of it? I'm impressed. Most people get bored after the third insubordination charge." "The part that interested me was the section on unnecessary risk-taking resulting in equipment loss. This project has a delicate and irreplaceable subject. I won't have it compromised by reckless piloting." Kaelen chuckled, a low, rumbling sound. "Reckless is a matter of perspective, Doctor. I prefer efficient. Sometimes the straightest line between 2 points involves breaking a few things. You've been listening to this sound for what, a year? And you're no closer to knowing what it is. I propose a quick flyby, a direct scan. We'll learn more in an hour than you have in 1,000 cycles." Elara's jaw tightened. His casual dismissal of her meticulous, patient work was infuriating. "That sound, as you call it, is a complex, layered signal that responds to passive observation. A direct scan from an active ship could disrupt it permanently. It could silence it forever. That is a risk I am not willing to take." "So we do nothing? We just sit here and listen?" he asked, gesturing around the lab. "With all due respect, Doctor, that doesn't sound like a plan. It sounds like a hobby." The insult landed like a physical blow. Before she could form a retort, an idea, sharp and vindictive, sparked in her mind. If he wanted to understand, she would show him. "You're right," she said, her voice deceptively calm. "You can't appreciate the subject without a proper introduction." She turned back to the console, her fingers flying across the controls. She bypassed the safety limiters, the audio dampeners, and pushed the raw, unfiltered signal directly through the lab's main speakers. The lament filled the room, not just as sound, but as a physical pressure. It was a wave of pure, concentrated melancholy, a chord of cosmic grief that vibrated in the bones. Kaelen, who had been in the middle of a dismissive retort, stopped dead. The charming smile vanished from his face, replaced by a flicker of profound confusion. His head tilted, his eyes unfocused. He raised his cybernetic hand, flexing the metallic fingers as if they'd gone numb. What is that?" he murmured, his voice losing its confident edge. "That is the signal," Elara said, watching him intently.
He didn't seem to hear her. A fine tremor ran through him. The silver lines on his neck pulsed with a faint, erratic blue light. "The feedback," he whispered, mostly to himself. It's wrong." He took a half-step back, his hand going to his temple as if fighting off a sudden blinding headache. The confident pilot, the maverick with a file as long as his arm, looked momentarily lost. He looked vulnerable. Just as quickly as it came, the mask was back in place. He straightened up, forcing a tight, unconvincing smile. "Interesting acoustics you have in here. Must be the ship's engines interfering with my comms link." It was a clumsy, transparent lie. Elara's keen eyes had missed none of it. The tremor, the pulsing light in her cybernetics, and the flash of genuine distress in his eyes. He had felt it, not just heard it, but felt it in his wiring and in his nerves. The signal had touched him in a way it had never touched anyone but her. She said nothing, merely arching an eyebrow. She lowered the volume back to a background hum, the ghost returning to its static. The mystery of Kepler 186f had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more dangerous.
Chapter 3: Shared Frequency. The silence that followed Kaelen's clumsy lie was heavier than the signal had ever been. The background hum of the lament was a ghost in the room, a witness to the tension stretched taut between them. Kaelen stood stiffly, his jaw set, the charming mask of the maverick pilot now looking like a poorly fitting replica. Elara watched him, her arms crossed, her mind cataloging his reactions with the same precision she applied to her data. The tremor, the pulsing light, the flash of raw panic, it was all evidence. "Interference?" she said, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut through his composure. "From the engines? This outpost runs on a closed geothermal loop, pilot. It's been silent for 50 years, and I'm fairly certain engine trouble doesn't cause proprietary Aegis cybernetics to light up like a festival beacon." Kaelen's gaze hardened. The vulnerability was gone, replaced by a defensive wall of hostility. "My cybernetics are my business, Doctor. They're sensitive pieces of equipment. A raw audio feed of that magnitude could trigger a dozen false positives. It's nothing." "It wasn't nothing," she insisted, taking a step closer. She couldn't let it go. This wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about understanding why he felt the need to lie. "You saw what you wanted to see," he shot back, his voice low and dangerous. "A ghost in the static. You're so desperate for this sound to be more than just noise that you're projecting. Now, if you're done with the parlor tricks, I have to prep my ship." He turned to leave, a clear dismissal. The finality of his movement spurred Elara into action. This was her only chance. The data was incomplete, the variable was walking out the door, and the truth was hiding behind his stubborn pride. "Fine," she said, her voice stopping him in his tracks. He turned back, one eyebrow raised in challenge. "Let's call it a controlled experiment. A baseline test to confirm your false positive theory." Before he could protest, she was back at the console, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. "The signal is comprised of thousands of frequencies, but there is one that acts as the spine, the core around which all the others are built. It's a frequency I've logged for months, the one that resonates most strongly with organic brain activity." She isolated it. 1.618 hertz. The golden ratio. A number so fundamental to the structure of life in the universe that its presence in the signal felt like a divine signature. She didn't amplify it to a deafening volume. Instead, she stripped everything else away, leaving only that one pure tone. She pushed it through the speakers. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling.
a single, resonant hum that seemed to bypass the ears and sink directly into the sternum. It was the vibration of a perfectly struck tuning fork the size of a solar system. The effect was instantaneous. Kaelen gasped, stumbling back as if shoved. Elara's own breath hitched in her throat, her hand flying to her console to steady herself. The lab didn't vanish, but for a single, heart-stopping second, it was overlaid with something else. A scent, sharp and clean, like the air after a lightning strike. Ozone. A color, a deep, impossible violet that bloomed behind their eyes, the color of a nebula seen from within. Light. A sensation, a dizzying, weightless feeling of falling, of being untethered from the ground, from reality itself. A fall. It was over as quickly as it began. The lab snapped back into sharp focus. The hum was gone. They were left panting in the sudden, profound silence, the shared experience a tangible entity in the air between them. They stared at each other, all pretense of hostility gone, replaced by a raw, mirrored shock. Kaelen's face was pale, his eyes wide with a terrifying, dawning understanding. His defenses were gone, shattered by an experience too bizarre to deny. "What was that?" he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. Did you see?" Elara's heart was hammering against her ribs. She finished his sentence, her own voice trembling slightly. "See the light? Smell the ozone?" His nod was almost imperceptible. The confirmation hung between them, irrefutable and terrifying. It wasn't a projection. It wasn't a false positive. It was real, and it was shared. They were connected, somehow, to this impossible sound and to each other through it. Before either of them could begin to process the implications, the lab door hissed open. Commander Reese stood in the doorway with a datapad in his hand. He took in their pale, shaken faces, his brow furrowing with a flicker of curiosity, but his expression quickly returned to business. "Good, you're both still here." He stepped inside. He didn't seem to notice the charged atmosphere. "I have your official mission parameters from Aegis." He handed the datapad to Kaelen. "Joint survey flight to Kepler 186F. You'll be their eyes and ears on the ground. They want a full sensory and geological scan of the signal's point of origin. Wheels up at 0600 tomorrow. No delays." He gave them a final, appraising look. "Aegis is watching this one closely. Try to play nice." He turned and left, the door hissing shut behind them, leaving them once again in a silence that was now heavier than ever. They were no longer adversaries. They were partners, bound by a secret they didn't understand and orders they couldn't refuse. The animosity had evaporated, replaced by a shared, uncanny sense of wonder and a deep, unspoken dread. They were in this together, whether they liked it or not.
Chapter 4. The Space Between. The cockpit of the scout ship Stray was a cramped, intimate space, built for one pilot and, at best, a co-pilot or a small cargo container. It was not designed for the heavy, unspoken tension that now filled every cubic centimeter of air between Elara and Kaelen. The pre-flight checks had been completed in a clipped, professional silence, each of them retreating into the familiar comfort of their respective disciplines. Kaelen's hands moved with practiced ease over the control yoke and holographic displays, while Elara ran final diagnostics on her portable sensor suite, the soft chimes of her system a counterpoint to the low thrum of the ship's ion drives powering up. As the Stray lifted from the outpost's launch pad and ascended into the black, Elara understood what the report had meant by maverick. Kaelen didn't so much pilot the ship as he did wear it. His movements were not the measured, precise actions of a transport pilot. They were aggressive, intuitive, a dance of instinct and machine. He banked and rolled with a visceral feel for the ship's limits, pushing the engines with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Elara's knuckles were white where she gripped the side of her console, her stomach lurching with every sudden course correction. My data indicates a more efficient trajectory if you adjust your pitch by 3.7 degrees, she said, her voice tight, breaking the silence. You're burning fuel unnecessarily. Your data doesn't account for the microgravity currents in this sector, Doctor. I'm flying the ship, not the numbers. Relax. I've done this once or twice. The numbers are a reflection of reality. Ignoring them is illogical. Sometimes you have to feel the reality, not just read it, he retorted. He scoffed, but she saw his fingers make a minute adjustment to the thrusters, bringing them closer to the vectors she had suggested. He wouldn't admit it, but he was listening. The journey passed in a state of strained truce. As they left the outpost far behind, and the rust-colored sphere of Kepler 186f grew larger in the forward viewport, the signal began to assert its presence. It started as a faint hum at the edge of Elara's hearing, a familiar ghost, but as they drew closer, it deepened, intensified. It was no longer a sound she could isolate in her lab. It was a pervasive pressure, a vibration that seemed to press against the ship's hull from all sides. Elara's head began to throb, a dull ache behind her eyes that slowly sharpened into a full-blown migraine. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on her breathing, but the resonant frequency was inescapable. It felt like it was inside her skull, a low hum that vibrated in time with her own pulse. Beside her, Kaelen was wrestling with his own demons. The silver lines on his neck were pulsing again, this time with a steady, rhythmic blue light that matched the core frequency of the signal. The holographic display over his cybernetic arm flickered with corrupted data, strings of alien code and fractured geometric shapes that overlaid his ship's telemetry. "Damn it," he muttered, shaking his head as if to clear it. "Systems having trouble filtering the interference." "It's not interference," Elara said through gritted teeth, pressing her fingers to her temples. "It's the signal. It's trying to interface." "Well, it can stop trying," he growled. They were entering the moon's upper atmosphere when it happened. A sudden, violent lurch threw them against their restraints. A cacophony of alarms blared through the cockpit, red lights flashing a frantic warning. "What was that?" Elara gasped, her eyes flying open. "Gravitational shear," yelled Kaelen, his hands a blur of motion across the controls. The ship was bucking like a wild animal, caught in an invisible celestial tide. The ship groaned, the sound of stressed metal, a terrifying scream. On the main screen, their altitude was plummeting. They were being pulled into a death spiral. "I can't pull up. The engines aren't responding." Kaelen's voice was strained, the charming pilot gone, replaced by a focused, desperate professional. Elara's mind, sharpened by adrenaline, cut through the pain of her migraine. Her training took over. "The shear is asymmetrical. It's stronger on the port side. You can't fight it head-on." Her fingers flew across her own console, pulling up geological and gravitational sensor data. Numbers and waveforms scrolled past her eyes. "There, the pocket is 1.7 kilometers wide. The gravitational gradient is weakest at its north pole. You have to roll with it, not against it. Use its own momentum to slingshot us out." "That's insane! If I time it wrong, it'll tear us apart." "If you don't, we'll be a new crater on the surface in 90 seconds, she yelled back, her voice ringing with an authority that surprised them both. "Now, Kaelen, you have to execute it. Now!" He stared at her for a fraction of a second, his eyes wide. In that moment, he saw not a timid academic, but a commander. He gave a sharp, decisive nod. "Give me the numbers, Doctor." "Bank right, 42 degrees, on my mark," she commanded, her eyes locked on the cascading data. "Thruster burst at 90% for 1.2 seconds. It has to be exact." "Ready." The ship shuddered violently. The alarms reached a pitch. 3, 2, 1, mark! Kaelen slammed the controls, rolling the Stray into the heart of the anomaly. For a terrifying moment, the force was crushing, the ship screaming in protest. Then, just as Elara's calculations had predicted, they hit the edge of the shear. Kaelen fired the thrusters, the burst of power propelling them forward. The ship shot out of the gravitational pocket like a stone from a slingshot, breaking free into the calm of stable orbit. The alarms fell silent. The red lights died. The only sound was their own ragged breathing in the sudden, profound quiet. Kaelen slumped back in his seat, his knuckles white on the yoke. Elara leaned her head back, the adrenaline leaving her weak and trembling. He turned to look at her, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. The maverick pilot and the cautious scientist had just flown through hell together, and they had only survived because for one critical moment they had moved as one. They had found a different kind of resonance.
Chapter 5. Point of Origin. The silence that descended in the cockpit was more profound than the vacuum outside. The only sound was their own ragged breathing, a stark, human rhythm against the backdrop of the cosmos. Kaelen's hands, which had been a blur of controlled panic moments before, now rested limply on the control yoke, his knuckles still pale. Elara leaned her head back against her seat, the adrenaline ebbing away to leave a trembling weakness in her limbs. The migraine that had been splitting her skull had vanished, burned away by the intensity of the moment. He turned to look at her, his expression stripped of all its earlier arrogance. What she saw in his eyes was a mixture of awe, respect, and a sliver of disbelief, as if he couldn't quite process what had just happened. The maverick pilot and the cautious scientist had flown through hell together, and they had only survived because for one critical moment they had moved as one. They had found a different kind of resonance, one forged in terror and trust. "Nice flying," she said, her voice quiet but steady. A slow smile touched his lips, genuine and free of its usual swagger. "I had a good navigator." The shared moment lingered, a fragile truce in the space between them. The professional barriers, the animosity, the distrust, it had all been torn away by the gravitational shear, leaving something new and uncertain in its place. Kaelen straightened up, his focus returning. "Okay, let's find a place to set this bird down before she decides to test us again." He brought up the landing display, but this time he turned to Elara. "Your sensors got us through that. Where do they say we should go?" It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. He was deferring to her data. She leaned forward, her own focus returning. "My readings show the signal's origin point is in that large crater to the south. It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone." He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The Stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater. the ship's legs sinking softly into a fine crimson dust. When the engines powered down, the silence was absolute. The moon was a world of deep reds and purples, bathed in the soft, perpetual twilight of its parent red dwarf star. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from jagged rock formations, and the sky was a swirl of violet and indigo, dusted with unfamiliar constellations. They donned their environment suits, a standard precaution, though the ship's sensors indicated the thin atmosphere was technically breathable, if not comfortable. Stepping out onto the surface felt like stepping into a dream. The gravity was slightly lighter, lending a buoyant, surreal quality to their movements. "Okay, Doctor." Kaelen's voice crackled over the private comlink in her helmet. "Where to?" Elara consulted the sensor suite integrated into her suit's wrist display. A clear vector pointed southeast, towards the crater's far wall. "It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone." He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater, the ship's legs sinking softly into a fine crimson dust. When the engines powered down, the silence was absolute. The moon was a world of deep reds and purples, bathed in the soft, perpetual twilight of its parent red dwarf star. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from jagged rock formations, and the sky was a swirl of violet and indigo, dusted with unfamiliar constellations. They donned their environment suits, a standard precaution, though the ship's sensors indicated the thin atmosphere was technically breathable, if not comfortable. Stepping out onto the surface felt like stepping into a dream. The gravity was slightly lighter, lending a buoyant, surreal quality to their movements. "Okay, Doctor." Kaelen's voice crackled over the private comlink in her helmet. "Where to?" Elara consulted the sensor suite integrated into her suit's wrist display. A clear vector pointed southeast, towards the crater's far wall. "It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone." He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater, the ship's legs sinking softly into a fine crimson dust. When the engines powered down, the silence was absolute. The moon was a world of deep reds and purples, bathed in the soft, perpetual twilight of its parent red dwarf star. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from jagged rock formations, and the sky was a swirl of violet and indigo, dusted with unfamiliar constellations. They donned their environment suits, a standard precaution, though the ship's sensors indicated the thin atmosphere was technically breathable, if not comfortable. Stepping out onto the surface felt like stepping into a dream. The gravity was slightly lighter, lending a buoyant, surreal quality to their movements. "Okay, Doctor." Kaelen's voice crackled over the private comlink in her helmet. "Where to?" Elara consulted a sensor suite integrated into her suit's wrist display. A clear vector pointed southeast, towards the crater's far wall. "It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone." He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater, the ship's legs sinking softly into a fine crimson dust. When the engines powered down, the silence was absolute. The moon was a world of deep reds and purples, bathed in the soft, perpetual twilight of its parent red dwarf star. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from jagged rock formations, and the sky was a swirl of violet and indigo, dusted with unfamiliar constellations. They donned their environment suits, a standard precaution, though the ship's sensors indicated the signal's origin point is in that large crater to the south. It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone. He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater, the ship's legs sinking softly into a fine crimson dust. When the engines powered down, the silence was absolute. The moon was a world of deep reds and purples, bathed in the soft, perpetual twilight of its parent red dwarf star. Long, skeletal shadows stretched from jagged rock formations, and the sky was a swirl of violet and indigo, dusted with unfamiliar constellations. They donned their environment suits, a standard precaution, though the ship's sensors indicated the signal's origin point is in that large crater to the south. It's the most stable geological formation on this hemisphere. It should provide a safe landing zone. He nodded, his hands moving with a newfound gentleness over the controls. The descent was smooth, a stark contrast to their chaotic arrival. The stray cut through the thin, rust-colored atmosphere, and the alien landscape of Kepler 186f resolved into breathtaking detail below them. They landed in the center of a vast, silent crater, the ship's legs sinking softly.
Chapter 6. The Feedback Loop. The moment Kaelen's fingertips brushed against the smooth, cool surface of the amethyst spire, the world fractured. It wasn't a sound or an explosion. It was a silent detonation of pure information. A wave of violet light erupted from the point of contact, washing over him, and the entire crystalline forest flared in sympathetic response. The low, ambient hum of the valley surged into a deafening, mind-splitting crescendo that had no sound, a pressure that felt as if it could crack the very foundations of reality. Kaelen was thrown back, not by a physical force, but by a psychic one. His body convulsed, his back arching as he hit the crimson dust. His environment suit's helmet slammed against the ground with a sickening crack. Through the visor, Elara could see his eyes roll back in his head, the only visible part of his face a mask of agony. "Kaelen!" she screamed, the name swallowed by the oppressive silence of the moon. She sprinted towards him, her scientific awe replaced by a surge of pure primal fear. The silver lines on his neck and arm were no longer pulsing with a soft blue light. They were blazing with a chaotic, strobing white light, flickering so fast it looked like liquid lightning trapped under his skin. His cybernetics were in critical overload. She fell to her knees beside him, her gloved hands hovering over him, unsure of where to touch. Her wrist display synced with his suit's vitals, and a string of red warnings filled her screen.
Tachycardia, unregulated synaptic firing, critical power fluctuations in all cybernetic systems. He was having a seizure, but it wasn't neurological, it was technological. The crystal had poured a universe of data into him, and his systems were tearing themselves apart trying to process it. Feedback loop, a total feedback loop, she muttered, her mind racing. The crystal was still pouring energy into him, the connection unbroken. She had to get him away. Gritting her teeth, she hooked her arms under his shoulders and dragged him, his body spasming and deadweight heavy. She pulled him backwards, away from the magnificent, terrible spire, her boots digging for purchase in the soft dust. With every meter she gained, the strobing light from his implants seemed to dim slightly. After 20 meters, his convulsions began to subside, replaced by violent, uncontrollable tremors. He was still alive. She didn't stop until they were at the edge of the valley, near the ridge they had climbed. Only then did she dare to check his condition more closely. He was unconscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. The light from his cybernetics had faded back to a dull, erratic blue. She ran a quick diagnostic on his helmet. The main seal was intact, but the comlink was fried. He was alone in there. Getting him back to the stray was a nightmare. She had to half-drag, half-carry him over the treacherous terrain, his dead weight a constant, grueling burden. Adrenaline and fear were the only things that kept her moving. By the time she got him through the ship's airlock and onto the deck, she was exhausted, her muscles screaming in protest. She managed to get his helmet off. His face was pale and slick with sweat, his expression slack. She pulled him onto the small med bunk, stripped off his heavy suit, and immediately began running a full diagnostic through the ship's medical interface. The readouts were unlike anything she had ever seen. His neural pathways were alight with activity, but the patterns were alien, chaotic. His cybernetics were reporting terabytes of corrupted data, a meaningless flood of information that had nearly shorted out his entire system. For an hour she worked, administering a neural sedative and running low-voltage purges through his cybernetic systems, trying to coax the foreign data out. Finally, his vitals stabilized, and the frantic energy patterns in his brain began to calm. She sank into the pilot's chair, her own exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. She watched him, his face now peaceful in sleep, the arrogant pilot stripped away to reveal someone fragile, someone vulnerable. 2 hours later, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with confusion. He tried to sit up, hissing in pain as his muscles protested. "Easy," Elara said softly, moving to his side. He blinked, his gaze slowly coming into focus on her face. "Elara," he rasped, his voice hoarse. What happened?" "You touched the crystal," she said simply. "It overloaded your systems. You've been unconscious for 3 hours." He sank back against the bunk, a shudder running through him. He closed his eyes, but she could see the memories flickering behind his eyelids. "It wasn't just data," he whispered, his voice trembling with a profound, soul-deep shock. "He saw it. I saw the city from our vision. I felt their suns on my skin. I felt them living, loving. And then I felt them dying. So much grief, Elara. An entire world of grief poured into me in a second." He took a ragged breath, the confession spilling out of him. "It felt like my own memories were being erased, overwritten by theirs. For a second, I didn't know who I was. I was just them." He looked down at his cybernetic arm as if it were a foreign object. Aegis told me these implants would make me stronger, faster, but they just made me a better receiver for a ghost's pain. In that moment, Elara didn't see a maverick pilot. She saw a man who had touched the infinite and been shattered by it. The clinical, scientific part of her brain that wanted to analyze his experience went silent. All she felt was a wave of overwhelming empathy. She sat on the edge of the bunk, her voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "My old crew," she began, the words tasting strange and unfamiliar. "After the accident, I see it every time I close my eyes. Not just see it, I feel it. The jolt, the silence. It's like a corrupted data fragment that plays on a loop, overwriting everything else. A feedback loop you can't escape." She looked at him, her own vulnerability a mirror to his. "Maybe that's what ghosts are, Kaelen. Not spirits. Just memories, trapped in a resonance we don't understand." He stared at her, a silent understanding passing between them. The professional barrier, the final wall of distrust, crumbled into dust, leaving them as two people, alone in the vast darkness, bound by the shared scars of a memory that was not their own.
Chapter 7. The Corporate Shadow. The flight back to the outpost was a study in quiet transformation. The cramped cockpit of the Stray, which had once been a battleground of wills, was now a space of shared, contemplative silence. The tension had not vanished, but it had changed its nature, evolving from adversarial friction into a shared gravity, pulling them together. Kaelen piloted the ship with a steady, gentle hand, his earlier recklessness gone. He was quiet, his gaze distant, fixed on the star-dusted blackness beyond the viewport. Elara knew he was replaying the torrent of alien memories, trying to separate their grief from his own. The maverick had been humbled, not by failure, but by a form of empathy so profound it had nearly erased him. She found herself watching him, not with the critical eye of a scientist, but with a new, unfamiliar sense of protectiveness. The variable she had once feared was now the only other person in the universe who understood the truth of what they had found. "We can't tell them," he said, his voice low, breaking the long silence. Elara nodded, her own thoughts running along the same track. "If we mention shared consciousness or a library of memories, Aegis won't send a science team. They'll send an expropriation unit. They'll try to mine it, weaponize it. They'll break it," Kaelen finished, a grim finality in his tone. They spent the last hour of the journey in a hushed conspiracy, drafting their report. It was a masterpiece of scientific misdirection, technically true in every detail, but emotionally and existentially sterile. They documented the discovery of the unique crystalline geological formations. They detailed the intense localized energy field. They reported Kaelen's adverse biological reaction to an unforeseen electromagnetic discharge, carefully omitting that the reaction was a flood of 1,000,000 alien souls. They framed the entire event as a hazardous but fascinating scientific problem to be solved, a geological anomaly, not a spiritual or historical one. They were building a wall of dry, boring data to hide the beautiful, terrifying miracle they had witnessed. Commander Riss met them in his office, his face etched with concern as he saw Kaelen's pallor.
The medics cleared you, but you look like you've seen a ghost, son." "Something like that, sir," Kaelen replied, managing a weak smile. They presented their report. Rhys read through it, his eyebrows climbing higher with every page. He was impressed by the discovery of the crystal forest, fascinated by the energy readings, and deeply concerned about Kaelen's condition. He accepted their story of the energy discharge without question. It was a known, if rare, risk of exploring geologically active worlds. "Incredible," Rhys said, setting the datapad down. "A forest of self-illuminating, energy-producing crystals. This is a major discovery. A major hazard, too. You both did good work. Take the next 2 cycles for recovery. That's an order." A wave of relief washed over Elara. It had worked. Rhys bought it. They had contained the situation, protecting the secret of the valley. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that they could control this, that they could guide the research and protect the memory of the Lumen from the rapacious grasp of Aegis Corp. It was a foolish hope, and it lasted for less than a minute. As Rhys was dismissing them, a sharp, intrusive chime echoed through his office. It was a Priority 1 directive, bypassing his command authority and projecting itself onto the main wall screen. The Aegis Corp logo, a stylized silver eagle clutching a planet, glowed ominously above the text. The message was cold, corporate, and absolute. Directive 734A. 1. All field analysis of Kepler 186f is to cease immediately. 2. The Kepler 186 system is under Aegis corporate quarantine, effective immediately. 3. Dr. Vance and pilot Kaelen are restricted to outpost confines pending debriefing. 4. Await arrival of Aegis Science Division vessel the Prometheus, ETA 48 standard hours. The words hung in the air, each one a hammer blow. Elara stared at the screen, the blood draining from her face. This wasn't the language of scientific inquiry. It was the language of a corporate seizure. The word quarantine was not for their safety. It was a cage. The phrase pending debriefing was not a request. It was an interrogation. She risked a glance at Kaelen. His face was a mask of cold fury. The look in his eyes was one she recognized from his file, the look of a man who did not tolerate cages. He understood exactly what this meant. Aegis hadn't been fooled by their report, or worse, they hadn't needed to be. The mere mention of a unique energy source was enough for them to lock the system down and claim it for themselves. Rhys swore, a low, vicious curse. "I don't have the authority to override this," he said, his voice tight with frustration. The brief sense of control Elara had felt was gone, evaporated under the cold, corporate glare of the directive. They hadn't protected the secret, they had gift-wrapped it. They were no longer explorers who had made a discovery. They were prisoners who knew too much. The clock was ticking. The Prometheus was coming. And as Elara looked from the glowing screen to the fury in Kaelen's eyes, she knew with absolute, chilling certainty that whatever Aegis had planned for that valley of memories, it was not understanding or preservation. It was desecration. And they had 48 hours to stop it.
Chapter 8. The Conspiracy of Two. The Aegis directive was a digital guillotine, severing their connection to the chain of command and leaving them isolated.
The outpost, once a place of scientific inquiry, had transformed into a gilded cage. Every corridor was monitored, every comm transmission logged. Elara could feel the unseen eyes of the corporation watching, waiting. The 48-hour countdown had begun, a relentless clock ticking towards their debriefing and the desecration of the Crystal Valley. Panic was a cold, sharp thing in Elara's chest, but she forced it down, burying it under a lifetime of disciplined thought. They needed to talk, somewhere beyond the reach of Aegis surveillance. She found Kaelen in the small, cramped shipside gymnasium, working through a series of slow, deliberate stretches. He was pushing his body, testing the limits of his recovery. The fury she had seen in Riss's office had cooled into a hard, dangerous resolve. He looked up as she entered, his eyes meeting hers. No words were needed. He knew why she was there. "Not here," he murmured, his voice low. He nodded towards a ventilation grate in the corner. Old maintenance tunnels, decommissioned after the geothermal conversion. "Follow my lead in 5 minutes." 5 minutes later, Elara was slipping through a dusty, forgotten access hatch into a network of narrow, dark tunnels. The air was stale and cold. The only light came from the faint glow of her wrist display. She found Kaelen waiting for her at a junction, his form a silhouette in the oppressive darkness. Here, surrounded by the silent, dead machinery of the past, they were finally alone. "They know," Kaelen said, his voice flat, devoid of its usual charm. "Or they know enough. A unique energy source on an uncharted moon? That's blood in the water for a shark like Aegis." "They'll separate us," Elara said, the words tasting like ash. "They'll pull every piece of data from my logs and every memory from your head. They won't care what the signal is, only what it can do. They'll strip that valley bare." "They'll try," Kaelen corrected her, a dangerous edge to his voice. He looked at her, his gaze intense in the dim light. "Which leaves us with one option." "Go back," she breathed, the words both terrifying and liberating. It was insane. It was impossible. It was the only choice they had. "The Stray is under total lockdown," he continued, already thinking through the logistics. "I can slice the launch protocols, but it'll be loud, digitally speaking. It'll trigger every alarm from here to Aegis headquarters. We'll have minutes, maybe less, before they send security to storm the launch bay." "And you're not fully recovered," Elara added, her gaze falling on his cybernetic arm. "Another overload like the last one could kill you." "It's a risk I'm willing to take," he said. "What about you, Doctor? You're a scientist. Your career, your reputation, it's all built on following the rules. This is treason. If we're caught, we'll spend the rest of our lives in an Aegis black site." He was giving her an out. She could refuse, accept her fate, and let the inevitable happen. The thought was nauseating. She thought of the crystal forest, of the silent, singing grief of 1,000,000 souls. She thought of the trust Kaelen had shown her, the shared vulnerability that now bound them together. Her old life, the one built on rules and data, felt like a distant memory. This was the new reality. "I have a theory," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound conviction. "The first time, in the lab, we both felt it. The second time, you touched the crystal alone and were overwhelmed. But what if it's not meant for one person? The signal resonates with human brainwaves, plural. The crystal isn't a transmitter, Kaelen. I think it's a receiver, an interface, and it requires a key." "A key?" "Sympathetic resonance," she explained, her excitement growing. "Two minds, in sync, focused on the same frequency. That's why we both saw the vision. It's a door that requires two hands to open. I have to know if I'm right. We have to go back." He stared at her for a long moment, a slow, genuine smile spreading across his face. It was the first time she had seen it since their flight. "A conspiracy of two, then." "A conspiracy of two," she agreed. The plan they formulated in the darkness was desperate and laced with risk. Kaelen would create a power surge in a non-essential sector of the outpost, a diversion to draw the few security personnel away from the docking bay. In that window, Elara would use her command-level access to override the initial security lockdown on the Stray's hangar doors. Then, Kaelen would do the hard part. A direct, brutal hack of the ship's flight controls, ripping it free from Aegis's digital chains. It was a point of no return. They were no longer a scientist and a pilot operating under orders. They were fugitives, acting against the most powerful corporation in the known galaxy. They were risking everything, their careers, their freedom, their lives, on a shared theory and a desperate hope. They made their way back to the main corridors separately, melting back into the routine of the outpost. As they parted, Kaelen paused. "Elara," he said, his voice serious, "whatever happens up there, thank you for not leaving me in that valley." "I know what it's like to be left behind," she replied softly. Their gazes locked, and in that silent, shared look, the pact was sealed. It was a promise stronger than any spoken word. They were in this together, and they would see it through to the end, whatever that end might be. Chapter 9. The First Verse. The 2 hours leading up to their planned escape were the longest of Elara's life. Every tick of the station chronometer was a countdown to the end of her career, her freedom, and possibly her life. She and Kaelen moved through the outpost like ghosts, performing their restricted duties with a feigned normality that felt like a lead weight in her stomach. They exchanged a single, sharp nod in a corridor, the final confirmation. The plan was in motion. From the quiet of her lab, Elara watched her console, her heart hammering against her ribs. At precisely 2200 hours, a series of emergency alerts flashed across her screen. A massive power surge in the hydroponics sector. Life support systems were failing in Bay 7. It was Kaelen's diversion, a brilliant piece of digital sabotage designed to look like a catastrophic equipment failure. A cacophony of alarms blared through the outpost, followed by the sound of running boots as the small security team scrambled towards the opposite end of the station. That was her cue. Her fingers flew across her own console, her movements swift and sure. She sliced through the first layer of security, her command-level access codes opening doors that were meant to remain sealed. A new countdown appeared on her screen. The system would automatically re-secure the hangar doors in 3 minutes. She ran. The corridors were deserted, the flashing emergency lights painting the walls in frantic strokes of red. She reached the observation deck overlooking the docking bay, just as Kaelen dropped from a ceiling access panel, landing silently on the deck below. He gave her a sharp nod. He sprinted to the Stray's cockpit, while Elara jacked her personal datapad directly into the hangar's master control panel. She bypassed the magnetic clamps and initiated the hangar door sequence. A deep, groaning sound echoed through the bay as the massive doors began to slide open, revealing the star-dusted blackness of space. 1 minute left. Inside the Stray, Kaelen was fighting a different kind of war. He had ripped open a control panel beneath the console, his cybernetic hand a blur as he physically interfaced with the ship's core systems. He was bypassing Aegis's digital lockdown, a brutal, direct hack that was the equivalent of performing open heart surgery with a sledgehammer. Sparks flew from the console. "Come on, Kaelen," Elara whispered, her eyes darting between the slowly opening hangar doors and the timer on her screen. 30 seconds. From the far end of the corridor, she heard shouting. Security was coming. They were out of time. "Kaelen, now!" she yelled into her comm. As if in answer, the Stray's engines roared to life with a sudden violent burst of power. The ship shuddered, lifting from the deck, free from its digital chains. Kaelen didn't bother with a gentle ascent. He fired the main thrusters, and the ship shot forward like a bullet, clearing the hangar doors just as they began to slide shut again. 2 security guards burst onto the observation deck, their weapons raised, but they were too late. They could only watch as the Stray banked hard and vanished into the night. The flight back to Kepler 186F was a desperate, high-speed burn. They were fugitives now, a fact that settled with a cold, terrifying finality. Kaelen pushed the ship to its absolute limit, his face a mask of grim concentration. They didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Their actions had said it all. They landed not with the caution of their previous trip, but with the urgency of a crash. The ramp was down before the engines had fully spooled down. They ran out onto the moon's surface, the violet light of the crystal forest beckoning them from across the valley. The air was thick with the resonance, a silent, powerful hum that vibrated in their very souls. It felt different this time, not just welcoming, but expectant, as if the valley had been waiting for them to return. They reached the central spire, its magnificent form pulsing with a soft internal light. They were both breathing heavily, their adrenaline-fueled escape giving way to a profound sense of awe and trepidation. This was it, the culmination of all the risk, all the fear. "Are you ready?" Kaelen asked, his voice quiet. Elara looked from his determined face to the glowing crystal. She thought of her lost crew, of the grief of the Luminen, of the cold, sterile future Aegis wanted to build. She nodded, her resolve hardening into steel. They stood side by side, a conspiracy of 2 against a universe of silence. Hesitantly, they raised their hands and placed them flat against the crystal's smooth, cool surface. Their fingers were inches apart. Elara closed her eyes. "Focus on the frequency," she whispered, "the one we felt in the lab. Focus on us." She cleared her mind of everything but the memory of that shared hum, that feeling of connection. She reached out with her thoughts, not to the crystal, but to Kaelen. She focused on their shared experience, on the trust forged in the heart of a gravitational shear, on the pact made in a dark and dusty tunnel. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she felt it, a warmth spreading from her palm, flowing up her arm. Through the crystal, she could feel Kaelen's presence, his own focused intent meeting hers. The resonance surged. The result was explosive. They were plunged into a full, vivid, shared vision. It was not the fleeting, fragmented glimpse. This was total immersion. They were standing in the heart of a breathtaking alien city, its crystalline towers scraping a sky lit by 2 suns. They felt the warmth on their skin, smelled the scent of strange blooming flora on a gentle breeze. They were surrounded by the lumen, tall, graceful beings of light, their forms shimmering and indistinct, but their thoughts, their emotions were as clear as spoken words. They felt a wave of communal joy, of profound peace, of a society so interconnected that loneliness was an impossible concept. They were not just seeing a memory, they were experiencing it. This was the first verse of the Signal song, a verse of life, and it was the most beautiful thing Elara had ever known.
Chapter 10. The Open Door. The vision shattered, not with a bang, but with a gentle, receding tide. Elara and Kaelen collapsed away from the crystal, landing softly in the crimson dust, their hands falling from its surface. They gasped for air, not because they were breathless, but because the atmosphere of their own world felt thin and empty compared to the rich, psychic tapestry they had just inhabited. Elara's mind reeled, awash with the aftershocks of the experience. The warmth of 2 suns still lingered on her skin. The silent, joyful chorus of 1,000,000 minds still echoed in the quiet corners of her own. It was not a memory she had watched, it was a life she had lived, if only for a few eternal seconds. The signal wasn't a cry for help or a warning. It was a welcome, an invitation into a memory so perfectly preserved that it was still alive. She looked at Kaelen. He was on his hands and knees, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't recovering from a psychic assault, but from a profound and heartbreaking beauty. He had felt it too, the peace, the connection, the utter absence of loneliness. He looked up at her, his eyes shining with unshed tears, and a look of such raw, staggering wonder that it stole her breath. "Did you see?" he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I saw," she breathed back. And in that shared gaze, they knew the truth. They were not just fugitives fighting a corporation. They were witnesses, the first to hear the song of a lost civilization in 600 years. They were standing on hallowed ground. As their senses slowly returned to normal, they noticed a change in the central spire. The soft, ambient violet light within it had coalesced. On the smooth surface where their hands had rested, a single, complex glyph was now glowing with a brilliant white light, etched into the crystal like a fresh scar. Elara's mind, trained to find patterns in the unknown, immediately recognized its structure. It was elegant, with root forms she had only ever seen in theoretical models of ancient universal languages, languages based on mathematics and physics, not sound. It was a symbol of pure concept. "What is it?" Kaelen asked, getting to his feet and staring at the glowing mark. "It's a word," Elara said, her voice filled with a sense of dawning awe. She took a step closer, tracing its impossible lines with her eyes. "It's a command, a key.
She looked at him, her heart pounding with the weight of the revelation. It means enter. As if the word itself were a trigger, the crystal responded. The glowing glyph pulsed once, a brilliant flash of light, and the deep, resonant hum of the valley shifted its pitch. At the base of the massive spire, the very fabric of space began to shimmer. Light bent and warped, coalescing into a perfect, shimmering circle about 3 meters high. It was a doorway, a portal of pure, swirling energy, its depths holding the impossible violet light of their shared vision. It was an open invitation into the memory, into the heart of the lumen. They stood frozen, staring at the impossible door that had opened before them. It was the answer to every question Elara had ever had about the signal. It was a gateway to a new frontier of existence, a chance to step inside the ghost in the static. It was a choice, a profound, terrifying, beautiful choice. And then that choice was ripped away from them. A shrill, piercing alarm blared through the private comlink in their helmets, a sound so violent and intrusive it felt like a physical blow after the serenity of the valley. Proximity alert, unidentified vessel, high orbit, rapid descent. Kaelen's head snapped up, his gaze sweeping the violet sky. Ilara's blood turned to ice. She scrambled to pull up the sensor data on her wrist display, her hands trembling. A single, massive contact was descending through the atmosphere. Its energy signature was heavy, military grade. Its trajectory was a direct, aggressive burn towards their location. It wasn't a science vessel, it was a warship. "It's the Prometheus," Kaelen said, his voice a low, vicious growl. "They're early. Damn it, they were tracking us the whole time. The lockdown was a trap to force our hand." They were caught. The realization hit with the force of a physical blow. Below them, in the valley, was a doorway to another world, an impossible invitation into the heart of a long-dead race. Above them, descending with terrifying speed, was the iron fist of Aegis Corp, a corporate behemoth that would dissect, commodify, and destroy the miracle they had just uncovered. They were standing on a precipice between 2 unknowns. Behind them, a doorway to a memory that could be heaven, or a soul-devouring trap. In front of them, the certainty of capture, interrogation, and the desecration of this sacred place. The Prometheus broke through the cloud cover, a black, angular shadow against the violet sky, its engines glowing with a malevolent red light. They were out of time.